And by the way, to your point, so I did want to address, I'll take another variable, training to failure.
Yep.
Which
That's where I wanted to go next.
Anyway, so good. So we carried out a meta-analysis on this topic, basically showed that you don't need to go to failure, that, as long as you're somewhat challenging the muscles, probably a couple or so reps in reserve from failure, that there really is not a benefit either certainly on strength and really on hypertrophy either. There's a lot of gaps in this literature. I wrote a whole blog post on this because, again, we carried out the meta-analysis. But when I'm coaching a competitive bodybuilder, am I just going to say, yes, that's the literature, so this is what we're doing? No, I mean, you then start to look at your own personal expertise and the needs and abilities of the individual. And there's been, again, no studies that have been carried out in very serious bodybuilders or just serious lifters. We just logically, you get to a certain point, you get closer and closer to the so-called genetic ceiling that you have, where it gets harder to get results. It becomes more and more difficult to challenge the body beyond its present state. And that's a tool that you can use, is to go to failure. There's been no studies that have looked at using selective training to failure. So where basically all the studies have either looked at training to failure for multiple sets or no sets, which is, again, a binary decision. You can go, let's say you're doing 4 sets. You could go first set 3 RIR, second set 2 RIR, third set 1 RIR, and then the last set to failure. Or there's a gazillion combinations. I think the combinations are unlimited, virtually unlimited. Mathematics isn't my strong suit, but you do those permutations. There's just so many different ways you can, depending upon the volume, that you can ultimately carry that out. So how do you then take that literature into context? And that's why, again, it's so important. There is a misperception that evidence-based practice is simply deferring to research to give you the answers. And I collaborated with a paper on a paper with a colleague, Henning Wackerhage, a good colleague of mine, a great researcher, and it was published about a year ago or a little less in the journal Sports Medicine on evidence-based practice and how specifically how to go about utilizing research, not to give you the answers, but to use as guidelines to guide your decision-making process. And we went through a whole explanation and discussion of the travails that are involved when you just try to defer to research. It's not the way research works in an applied field. So, again, I've fortunately, I think one of the reasons that my research has become as popular as it is because, number one, I've been a bodybuilder, and number two, I was a trainer, and I understand the practical applications. And I'm basically, like I said, the kid in the candy store who is answering questions that I wanted to know as a bodybuilder and a trainer, and thus it has relevance to what other people want to know. So, and with that, by the way, I always tell, so I'm a professor, college professor. I tell all my students that if you want to become a researcher in an applied science like exercise, at least for a period of time, a couple of years, 2, 3, 4+ years, get in the field, be a practitioner, work as a personal trainer, strength coach, whatever disciple, whatever your research focus you want, become a practitioner in that area so you can understand the nuances. And thus, when you then carry out your research, you're going to have an understanding of the gaps and how they should be answered.
Yeah. Well, I think part of being evidence-based is really, so you look at the evidence from research, and then you go evidence-based off from your personal experience, and then
Correct.
You can kind of use that and then even incorporate some individual difference within the population. So with yourself or someone you're working with, like, you recognize, hey, not everyone responds the same. Like, research is kind of averages. There's always going to be some outliers.
Great point. Yeah. So, and you kind of hit the nail on the head that number one, research reports the means, and people are not a mean, an average. So that'll get you within the ballpark for a lot of people, but they're not only your outliers, but there are people somewhere within the borders of those outliers, and that you need to tweak things. They also, like I said, there's so many gaps in the literature. Research generally studies one condition against another condition. There's so many permutations. It's not binary. So like I said, it's like studying all sets to failure versus no sets to failure. That's one way that you could carry out a training program. It certainly isn't the only way. And it's probably the way that most people do not, high level people don't train. Certainly I don't train like that.
Yeah.
And I coach people. And most people I know don't train that way. Most high level people, at least that I know. So it behooves people to really have an understanding when they're looking to defer to evidence-based practice, that they are not just taking the research and saying that's the be all end all, because there's gaps and there's limitations. So research can provide guidelines, general guidelines, and then it's up to the individual to use their own expertise in conjunction with the needs and abilities of the individual that they're working with, the trainee, whether it's themselves or whether they're training someone else or coaching someone else.